Eternity is not just a gift, but a trial. Amid the decaying halls of New Orleans and the shadowy alleys of Europe, Louis de Pointe du Lac crosses centuries, bearing a burden few could endure. It is not just the thirst for blood that torments him, but the relentless search for meaning in an existence that defies all human certainty. How does one adapt to immortality when one's consciousness refuses to accept the cost? In this video, we will dive into the story of Louis de Pointe du Lac, exploring his life before the transformation, his tumultuous relationship with Lestat and the internal conflicts that shaped his journey. We will see how his quest for answers and his reluctance to embrace his vampiric nature made him one of the most complex characters in Gothic literature. By following this narrative, you'll understand not only Louis's trajectory, but also the moral and existential dilemmas that permeate his story. Each choice, each sacrifice, and each revelation lead us to reflect on the limits of humanity and what it truly means to exist beyond time. Louis de Pointe du Lac was born in 1766 in Louisiana, heir to a prosperous sugar plantation. Surrounded by luxury and tradition, he grew up in a world where power and status determined the fate of men. However, despite his privileged position, a void haunted him. The weight of responsibilities, combined with the early loss of his family, plunged him into a spiral of melancholy. The death of his younger brother, an event shrouded in mystery and guilt, was the breaking point. Louis began to wander through New Orleans, surrendering to games, drinks, and reckless risks. His life became a series of nights where he sought meaning in decadence. For him, human existence no longer had purpose. He sought neither redemption nor escape, only a way to silence the constant pain consuming him. Louis's internal struggle was far from a simple matter of morality. Each night, he found himself further removed from the person he once was. The man who had once sought meaning in pain and emptiness now found himself trapped in an endless existence, filled with temptations his conscience still refused to accept. The transformation, which had initially seemed like a promise of liberation, quickly became an eternal prison. He could never turn back. Death, which he had longed for, was replaced by an eternity of torment and questions. The contrast between him and Lestat grew more pronounced. While Lestat embraced chaos with pleasure, seeing violence as an expression of his vampiric nature, Louis observed everything with a distant, apathetic gaze. Like a spectator of a macabre show, he was no longer human, but he also didn't feel he belonged to this new existence. Lestat's blood, which had transformed him, now became poison that corrupted his soul, a constant reminder of a choice he hadn't made, or rather, a choice that had been forced upon him. Lestat knew that his control over Louis was not only physical. He understood him too well to realize that, deep down, Louis would not be easily molded. He tried in every way to persuade him to fully surrender to the pleasures of immortality, convincing him that living like him was the only way not to lose himself completely. But Louis never gave in, always resisting. With every confrontation, the hatred between them grew. It was as if Lestat wasn't just his creator, but his tormentor, bent on subjugating his will and forcing him to live a life Louis considered monstrous. On the rare occasions when Lestat showed any empathy, it was a distorted form of affection, a perversion of his own vision of love and power. He knew he had a unique hold over Louis, that no one else would ever understand him the way he did. He had made him immortal, and that made him, in a sense, his property. But what Lestat couldn't understand was that by forcing Louis to live, he was only feeding his revolt, a growing resentment that made him stronger, more aware of his own emotions, more determined to find an alternative path. Louis spent his immortal nights trying to find something that could resemble the humanity he had lost. Between loneliness and regret, he questioned the true meaning of his existence. What was left for someone who could no longer die, but also could not live as before? He sought answers in the shadows, in the silence of endless nights. But the only thing he found was the echo of his own anguish. The world was constantly changing, but he remained unchanged, at the mercy of his creator and his fate. Time, which for Lestat was an ally, a blank canvas on which he painted his immortal victories, was for Louis a prison. With each passing day, he moved further away from the person he once was, from the person he could have been, had he been given the chance to live and die. But death, which he so desperately desired, seemed to be the one thing he could never again attain. And while Lestat continued to dance in the shadows with a victorious smile, Louis was forced to watch, silent and condemned, his own decay. In the midst of the conflict between Louis and Lestat, an unexpected figure emerged to change the dynamic between them. One fateful night, while wandering the streets of New Orleans, Louis found an abandoned child next to her lifeless mother's body. Moved by guilt and the desire for consolation, he approached, but his hunger took control. Unknowingly, he bit her, tasting the blood of an innocent, an act that immediately haunted him. Lestat, seeing an opportunity to keep Louis by his side, intervened. He transformed the girl into a vampire, giving rise to Claudia, the immortal child. Her small body now housed a sharp mind and an uncontrollable thirst. For Louis, she became a daughter. For Lestat, a promising disciple. For a time, Claudia brought balance to the relationship between the two, uniting them as a dysfunctional family. However, as the years passed, Claudia realized the cruel reality of her condition. Though her mind matured, her body would never change. She would forever be trapped in the fragility of childhood, unable to experience the full freedom of vampiric existence. Her frustration turned to hatred, first towards Lestat, who had created her without her consent, and then towards Louis, who had lacked the courage to stop it. This hatred culminated in a bold plan, the destruction of Lestat. Claudia wanted to break free from the bonds that held them and start a new life with Louis. Coldly calculated, she poisoned her creator, weakening him before slashing him with a blade and throwing him into the swamp. The illusion of freedom, however, would not last. The past never completely disappears, and the blood ties between them would still demand their price. With Lestat seemingly out of the picture, Louis and Claudia set off in search of answers. The promise of finding other vampires, perhaps wiser or different from Lestat, led them across the ocean to Europe. However, this journey, which began as a search for belonging, soon revealed itself as a deeper descent into darkness. In the first few months, they traveled through quiet cities and forgotten ruins, finding only echoes of the past. The ancient vampires they had heard so much about seemed to have disappeared, leaving only legends and stories of creatures that had extinguished with time. Claudia's hope began to wear thin, and Louis, always burdened by uncertainty, feared that their search might be in vain. It was in Paris that they finally found others of their kind. Beneath the facade of the Théâtre des Vampires, a group of vampires led by Armand captivated and terrified human audiences with macabre performances. The vampires of the theater, unlike Lestat, seemed to have a purpose, a code of their own for existing among mortals without bringing destruction. Armand, the eldest among them, became an enigmatic figure for Louis, offering him a new perspective on what it meant to be immortal. However, Claudia quickly realized the hidden danger. Armand saw in Louis a kindred spirit, someone who could walk beside him for centuries. But to do so, Claudia needed to be discarded. For the vampires of the theater, her existence was an affront, as creating a child vampire was an unforgivable violation of the unwritten laws of immortality. Without Louis realizing it, their fate was already sealed. The past, once again, was catching up with them, and a new tragedy was on the horizon. The presence of Claudia among the vampires of the Théâtre des Vampires did not go unnoticed. To them, creating a child vampire was an unforgivable violation of the unwritten laws of immortality. Vampires should only be transformed when they had reached maturity and could comprehend and deal with eternity. Claudia's existence was seen as an abomination, an adult soul forever trapped in a child's body. Santiago, one of the cruelest vampires of the theater, had harbored distrust for Louis from the beginning. His connection with Armand and his reluctance to embrace his vampiric nature made him an easy target. But it was the murder of Lestat, who somehow survived and came to Paris seeking revenge, that sealed Claudia's fate. He denounced Louis and Claudia as traitors, and the vampires of the theater decided to punish them. The verdict was swift and brutal. Louis was imprisoned in a coffin and sealed in a wall, condemned to wither in eternal darkness. Claudia, on the other hand, received an even worse sentence, along with her new companion Madeleine, a woman she had turned so she could have a vampiric mother. Claudia was left to die under the sun, unable to escape. When Louis was rescued by Armand, it was too late. All that remained of Claudia were ashes scattered on the ground. Claudia's death was the final blow for Louis. The pain of watching her die, the rage at his impotence in the face of the vampire tribunal, and the betrayal by Lestat and Santiago fueled something new within him. Where once he was a vampire who resisted violence, now he longed for revenge. The compassion that remained in his heart was suffocated, and his fury would set everything around him aflame. Claudia's death marked a definitive transformation in Louis. The vampire who had spent centuries battling his own nature now surrendered to the desire for vengeance. Consumed by pain and hatred, he refused to allow those responsible for his loss to continue existing without consequence. Alongside Armand, who silently allowed the destruction of his own companions, Louis returned to the Théâtre des Vampires under the cover of night, determined to reduce everything to ashes. The execution of his revenge was meticulous and relentless. Waiting until the vampires in the theater were asleep in their underground hideouts, Louis spread flammable oil throughout the building. With a single torch, he started a devastating fire that consumed the theater and condemned them to flames they could not escape. The screams of Santiago and the others were muffled by the roar of the fire, and by dawn, nothing remained but charred ruins. But while revenge brought him some relief, it also deepened his isolation. Armand, who could have saved Claudia, revealed himself to be just as manipulative as Lestat, shaping events to ensure Louis was free to follow him. The theater was gone. The enemies were dead. But Louis realized this did not bring redemption, only more emptiness. He was beginning to understand that no act, no matter how violent or definitive, could erase his pain. Refusing to be bound to another master, Louis rejected Armand and left. His journey through Europe was coming to an end, but his search for purpose continued. The modern world was approaching, bringing changes even vampires could not ignore. Louis, now more disillusioned than ever, was about to enter a new array, a time where solitude would be his only constant companion. As the centuries passed, Louis watched the world change before his eyes. Old Europe was left behind, and he returned to America, where cities were growing and time seemed to speed up relentlessly. Modernity brought electric lights, automobiles, skyscrapers, and a pace of life that left little room for creatures of the shadows. What had once been a world of superstition and legends was now transforming into a landscape ruled by logic and science. Still, Louis remained a silent observer, a vampire moving through time without attachment to anything or anyone. Without a clear purpose, he wandered through the decades, resisting the urge to form new bonds, aware that any connection would end in tragedy. His immortality was no longer a burden merely because of his thirst for blood, but because of his inability to forget. Every lost face, every decision made, every mistake committed echoed in his mind like a specter that accompanied him. Time did not heal his wounds, it only made them deeper. Louis's decision to share his story with Daniel Malloy was not just an attempt to seek redemption or understanding, but a cry of desperation, a final attempt to find some true connection with humans. For centuries, he had lived as a shadow, haunted by the weight of his choices, by his denial of mortality, and by the unending search for a purpose that always eluded him. Immortality, which had seemed like the answer to his empty existence, had become an unbearable weight, and now, on a stifling, silent night, he found himself finally before someone who, though skeptical, was willing to listen without judgment. Louis poured out his story with an intensity so visceral that, by speaking of his past, he could, at least for a moment, live an illusion of belonging. Each word was like a stab to his own heart, a reminder of the deaths he could never forget, the nights of solitude that ruined his soul. He detailed his transformation, his encounters with Lestat, the bitter reality of his eternal search for something more. The blood that coursed through his veins was no longer a link to life, but a curse. Lestat's attempt to mold him into a vampire without remorse resonated in every word, and Louis's suffering only deepened as he saw the young journalist fascinated by the idea of immortality. To Daniel, what was a burden to Louis seemed, in fact, a unique opportunity. Eternal youth, the ability to live without limitations, these were seen as gifts that few could desire. However, when Daniel expressed his wish to be like him, a wave of disillusionment ran down Louis's spine. He realized, perhaps for the first time so clearly, that mortals would never understand the gravity of what he carried. The weight of eternity was not something that could be shared. Louis's words, meant to warn, to teach the young man about the true meaning of being immortal, were absorbed as a fantastical tale, a fantasy to feed the human ego, and not as a painful reflection of what he had become. Deep down, he had always known that, although humans longed to escape mortality, they only understood the superficial part of what that would mean. They did not comprehend the endless nights, the burden of eternal silence, and the loss of any genuine connection. What seemed like a fleeting spark of hope for Louis' possibility of being understood, of perhaps finding a spirit that shared his pain dissolved like mist at dawn. He saw that in fact, immortality was not something that could be shared, that there was no room for redemption in a life marked by impossible choices. Daniel, with his youth, his energy, and his naive view of eternal life, represented everything Louis could never have again. The simplicity of desire, the belief in tomorrow. After sharing his testimony, Louis walked away once more. He knew that, in following his solitary path, he would continue to lose himself, but at least he would be free of that futile search for meaning. The irony of his existence was that, by trying to teach someone about the weight of his immortality, he found no more space to try to find a purpose. His story, which was his own prison, became just another burden in the hands of those who heard it. Louis left behind more than just a fascinated journalist, but the hope that someday someone might truly understand the abyss in which he found himself. He disappeared into the night, once again becoming a legend, a shadow in the past. The vampire who sought humanity but would never find it became a metaphor not only for the human condition, but for all those condemned to seek meaning in a world where immortality cannot save what is lost. If you found yourself moved, perhaps more deeply than you expected, by hearing Louis's anguish, don't forget to leave a like. Share your thoughts in the comments about the search for purpose, love, and redemption that he so longed for. And of course, subscribe for more stories from the depths of Gothic literature where shadows never dissipate. Because, in the end, that is what defines our existence. What we do with the time given to us, and what we are able to learn when it is no longer within our reach. Until the next night, when darkness holds more secrets than we can imagine.